We will also start recording. All right, so welcome back. Today we will be jumping into the kind of start of the meat and potatoes of talking about some of these things. Obviously, to be able to discuss effectively the different countries that we'll be examining in some of the case studies throughout the semester, we have to lay down a foundation of what all exactly it is that we're talking about. So you'll see, I think that by and large, there are a lot of things in comparative politics that seem commonplace, a lot of terms that we'll use that you probably are familiar with. As far as how they're used may or may not line up with what you've heard in the past. I'll give you an example of this. And this is one that we have done a project on that I'll actually probably go ahead and post to our class if you'd like to watch it. But my department head and I were having a conversation a couple of years ago about what the term socialism actually means. Because in the past, I don't know, I would say maybe 7 years-ish in the United States, the term socialism has kind of changed significantly in what it actually means and how people are actually using it on a day-to-day basis. Some people use the word socialism as basically a derogatory term, describing anything that they don't like, that they see as government overreach, that they see as something that the government is has too much involvement in, or taking it past a kind of purely economic definition and looking at socialism as essentially an analog to fascist control of individuals' lives. You also have politicians who are using it this way. It's not just people who haven't studied political science. It's people who know what these terms mean that will use it that way, and will use it as a buzzword. We'll use it as something to attack a political opponent. You also have politicians who use it as almost a badge of pride. There are some politicians who have called themselves, democratic socialists, or just flat out. I've seen Bernie Sanders say that he is a socialist, and that that term has meaning and has significance. It has a definition that political scientists acknowledge and have created and written about for decades. But just because that's how we see the term doesn't mean that's how the term is really being used. And we're seeing that juxtaposition between different terms that come in and out of fashion, and are used in different ways. So we'll run into a few of those. I think socialism is a good example of one, but we'll run into a few of those throughout this course, where what we mean and what we're talking about in terms of using these ideas or using these terms in context of comparative politics may not exactly line up with what you may be familiar with already from your experience out in the world. That doesn't mean that either one is more or less valid than the other. Obviously, I think that there is value in understanding how terms are being used and what effect that has on the way that we discuss politics out in the world. So there is value in understanding that. There's also value in making sure that here in this class and on campus in political science classes, that we're trying to use those terms consistently just for the sake of clarity, so that, as we're discussing these things, we're coming from a place of understanding what each other is saying. When we use terms, I'll just jump ahead a little bit in today, when we're talking about states and nations and countries and territories, all of these different terms are things that I think are often used just interchangeably in our world. We don't often separate countries from states, or when we don't need to, we use the term nation very interchangeably with country, even though in specific instances those terms do need to be separated out, and they do have little but significant differences that help us to use them accurately to identify what we're talking about. So it's just things like that, laying some of these foundational questions and some of these foundational problems out, so that we can address them and know together where exactly we're coming from when it comes to these kinds of questions. Political science in general, comparative politics more specifically, is really concerned mostly with the how and why of politics. And politics, even in and of itself, is probably something that we should lay a groundwork of what we're talking about. Politics has a variety of different definitions. We have definitions that lie mostly in the governance of individuals, the creation and execution of government, the interactions of what that government is. So, politicking, the kind of active verb form of it, going out and, being a representative, the actions that representatives take on behalf of their citizens in a democracy, things like that. You also have this more general understanding of what politics can be, which has its historical basis going all the way back to ancient Greece, which was that essentially politics was anything that existed outside of the sphere of your private home. In ancient Greece, they were very concerned with spheres of influence. And so anything that happened in your private home was seen as, being outside of politic. It was something that was private. It was a different sphere than your interactions with other households. But as soon as you set foot outside of that home and had any interaction, be it, monetary interactions, going to the market, talking to people about ideas, participating in actual governance, being a member of the Senate in Athens, things like that, anything outside of the home was considered to be political. And I think that even to this day, both of those definitions hold some kind of value, understanding that anything, any action, anything that you say can be political. And that doesn't necessarily make it bad. We have this kind of understanding, I think, in modern culture, that things we're not supposed to talk about are politics and religion. Kind of that Thanksgiving dinner rule, that those are the things you don't talk about with your crazy uncle, whichever I don't know. I feel like everyone has a crazy uncle. Like, if you're conservative, you have a crazy uncle who's, on the left. If you're, if you're liberal, you have a crazy uncle who's on the right. Like, everyone just has a crazy uncle that they disagree with. It's the stuff, that you're not supposed to talk about with them. That's the stuff that we study. And there has to be a functional way of studying that without always coming into conflict with one's own personal beliefs. So there are things that we'll be discussing in this class that I hope we can discuss in that way, that we're looking not just at that private individual sphere of influence, but how these things exist on the larger scale. Why there are terms like socialism that, here in the United States have taken on these very different meanings than they would if you went, to pretty much any country in Europe and talked about socialism. There it is not a derogatory. It's there are parties in almost every European country that identify as socialist parties. There are, even extreme forms of socialism. When we, look at active politicians in the United States, At the most, they're kind of on the middle edge of socialism. There are true socialist parties out there that seek to change the entire economic structure of countries and have that kind of influence. So we'll be talking about those things, but I think it's important to come back to the fact that political science is concerned with the how and why of politics, not as much with the predictive aspect of politics. And I know that that can be a little frustrating sometimes, especially in a world as polarized as we see our current political interactions. It would be nice to be able to say, oh, well, if you just study this long enough, you'll be able to know what's going to happen next in politics. You'll be able to tell, who's likely to win the election, the midterm elections this fall. Yeah, we have predictions. We have, the mathematical side of our field that can study, the most likely outcomes. There's always a human level of error in that. There's always that component of it that says, yeah, as much as we can predict, as much as we think we can know, it's never truly going to be all that accurate. And we are doing our best to not go into that too far, because once you go into that kind of predictive aspect, if you give too far into the soothsaying side of trying to predict what comes next, you will you end up not being able to focus as well on what is happening now. And that is another challenge that political science faces. So we're going to start talking into some of these basic concepts that we need to understand to be able to move on and discuss these countries in their different contexts. That also means that I want us to be critical of the textbook that we are reading. There is no perfect textbook out there by any means. I think this one is pretty good. That's the most praise that I'll give it. It's a pretty good textbook. It covers, what we need it to cover as far as, the definitional side of things, these introductory concepts, so that we can start from the same place when it comes to approaching comparative politics. It does a good job of covering a wide variety of countries and giving you the basic information to be able to analyze those countries, and especially to be able to compare those countries side by side. But it is not perfect. And there are issues that I take, and a few of the things that I want to talk about today are just examples of that, so that you can look at this text and understand that not everything it says is going to be absolutely right. I may have mentioned my approach to quiz grading, or I may not have. So if I haven't, I'll just go ahead and say it now. The quizzes in this class are also not perfect, because nothing ever is. And so sometimes you'll find a quiz question that sort of aims at the best right answer. Not that there's only one correct answer, even out of the multiple choice questions. And so if you feel that a quiz question is marked wrong, but you feel that your answer was correct, and you can back that up with some argument, hopefully based in fact or citation, if you send that to me, I will absolutely go back and look at your quiz and potentially regrade it, because I truly believe that there is no such thing as this perfect right answer, especially when it comes to political science. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about with issues in the textbook, pretty early on, I think in the chapters for this week, the book makes comment about this return to religion in politics, saying that in the past 25 years, there has been sort of this, unilateral shift towards religion and politics interacting more than they ever have. And I think that looking at the history of not just this country but also many other countries in the world, I think that that's a pretty bold and not really accurate claim to make, because there isn't really a lot of evidence to show that the two were ever fully separated. To pull a few of these, different examples from history, that we have seen of interactions between religion and politics. In the Marxist-Leninist revolution, a lot of the attempts to eradicate Eastern Orthodoxy were used as justifications for implementing Marxism. Marxism at its core was it is a fundamentally anti-religious type of approach to governmental organization. We will talk about what the ists and isms all mean, as well as we move forward on this. But the concept that at any point there wasn't a religious aspect to something like communism, even though communism itself is an atheistic type of government, it still has a strong religious tie at its core. It may strive towards scientific atheism, but in the revolutionary form, it has also sought to overthrow religious orders in most of the countries that it has, tried to take root in. In Soviet Russia, this resulted in the mass killing of approximately 10 to 20 million Christians during the time that the Soviet Union was being formed. So this is not, there's no way to even say that this is a purely theoretical idea of a way of looking at the growth of Marxist-Leninism. This is very real and has very real impacts on our world. Obviously something that has come to further prominence since 9/11, but has existed for thousands of years in various parts of the world, are different theocratic Islamic societies. This is I think that there is a little bit of a misunderstanding around the concept of Sharia law, but understanding that there is a belief system within Islam that ties together religion and the obedience to religious law, that applies in certain parts of the world. Generally, it applies only to adherents of the religion. That's, I think, something that gets misconstrued often when we talk about, the formation of Islamic states. But there are, within this, there are extremist views out there of, things like ISIS and other terrorist organizations that believe fundamentally that the establishment of an Islamic society requires overthrowing an established Christian order that is perceived to be in control. And so we do see this kind of interaction. That's, not to say that that is the majority. That is a absolute minority of the religion of Islam. There are approximately, I think, somewhere in the range of 2 billion practicing Muslims in the world. So to, equate these two things, to say that, the actions of that absolute minority somehow represent the majority of people in that religion, is absolutely false. And the differentiation between what Sharia law means and how it is implemented is also a question of different branches of Islamic, or of Islamic belief. So it's, this problem that we have of taking this concept and trying to understand this concept while also putting it into different categories, trying to organize it in a way that isn't necessarily endemic to the way it's actually believed and practiced in different parts of the world. Um, we also, this all ties in, I think, with this overall process of decommunization. I mentioned the growth of Marxist-Leninist beliefs and how that interacted with religion. We also, as countries have gone through processes of adopting communism and later maybe unadopting communism, we see the same process where sometimes that comes from a religious standing, and there is a strong push in the religious belief of a country to decommunize and to find alternate routes of, returning to a certain religious belief. In the United States, this expressed itself not coming out of communism, but as a desire in the 1800s for a different economic system. This expressed itself as the Great Awakenings. So this is also not something that we don't see here in the United States. We have seen this interaction come and go in various forms. We like to think, I think most often, we like to think that in the United States, there is a wall of separation between church and state. But I think it's also important to always go back and understand that that is not something that is enshrined in the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States establishes something of a respectful separation, but only insofar as it says that Congress shall not make laws that directly affect an individual's right to practice or the establishment of a state religion. There's still an immense amount of interaction between government and religion in this country. And so these are things that are experienced all over the world. We're probably going through the process of, something akin to one of the previous Great Awakenings right now, as the United States is figuring out, as jurisprudence that was established in the 70s around the question of abortion has now been overturned, and has been overturned by overtly religious organizations that have been organized and trying for the past 40 years to overturn the decision of Roe v. Wade. That calls into question how we are going to proceed forward and what that will look like in the United States. We might turn to a country like Ireland for advice. Ireland has gone back and forth over the past 50 years on the question of how legal abortion should be. And so again, something that's not only being dealt with in the United States, but something that is being dealt with around the world, are these major significant questions of how much or how little interaction we want between religion and politics. So I don't think that it's fair for the textbook to set down something like, oh, there's a return to religion in politics over the past 25 years, when that is clearly something that has never truly been a part or never truly been fully joined in a place like the United States, in most of the countries that we'll be studying, or in those instances where they have been joined for significantly longer than that. The interaction between religion and politics in a country like Iran massively predates, the past 25 years. That is a long established interaction that we'll talk about when we get there. So things like that, where there are going to be instances in the textbook of essentially oversimplification, an issue where these are very complex issues that we have to deal with. When we try to simplify them for the sake of what the author, what O'Neill was trying to get at in this text, it's going to make it so that it's not entirely accurate as we can discuss it. That in and of itself could be a great discussion question for this class. So as you're reading, in a few weeks, you'll be submitting discussion questions for the sake of our discussion sections. I encourage you to start thinking in those terms. If you read something in the textbook that doesn't quite line up right, that doesn't quite hit home, like I said, for me, this line about the return to religion and politics, that doesn't quite line up right. And I think that that's an area where we can discuss how accurate and how much we're really seeing out of the textbook. Another issue that I think the textbook sometimes glazes over is an essential problem with this question of analysis. We are in this class, we're going to be doing our best to analyze a couple of countries in specific terms, looking at specific political or economic aspects of countries and how they function. There's always going to be this missing problem, this missing step problem when it comes to analysis. We will never have the complete amount of information that is necessary. And I'm sorry if this meme, whoops, I did not mean to do that. I'm sorry if this meme is a little bit outdated at this point. I just think the South Park way of expressing this is the most accurate I've ever seen. You've got this, oftentimes in political science, you have this starting point that is readily and easily identifiable. For instance, taking out of the textbook, there is a line that says, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt was forced to resign after 20 years in rule. Okay, what the hell does forced to resign mean? That's the ... of this meme. Okay, the starting place, which is Hosni Mubarak has been in power for 20 years. After that period, the ... he no longer is in power. Okay, does forced to resign mean that he was voted out? And in order to concur with the will of the people in Egypt, he was forced to step down from his position? Does it mean that the people rioted and stormed the presidential palace and removed him from the presidential palace? You could use the phrase forced to resign in both of those instances and it would be accurate, but saying that does not convey what it really means for Hosni Mubarak to be forced to resign. So it's an issue that, again, we're going to run into with one or even a few authors writing a textbook like this, where their point is that Hosni Mubarak is no longer in power. So they choose to use the phrase Hosni Mubarak was forced to resign after 20 years. But that is giving you an incomplete picture of what really happened. And so to understand that, I mean, obviously you could write an entire paper just on the process of Hosni Mubarak being removed from power in Egypt. It is a complicated series of issues. I mean, to give you the very simple form, his security forces decided to refuse to continue following his orders. And his orders at the time seemed to have been that they were to open fire on protesters outside of the presidential palace when he refused to go ahead and peacefully step down from his position. So I think that meaning of was forced to resign takes on a very different aspect than saying it that way. Politely asking someone to step down from their position is very different from his own security forces refusing to follow his orders to open fire on protesters. Those kinds of decisions, though, are the decisions that people make when they have to write textbooks. And there are going to be instances in this textbook of that, of selecting phrases that may not fully convey the actual process that happened, that phase two of this meet. So those are, again, open areas that if you see something like that and you're like, I feel like Hosni Mubarak may not have just like decided to retire, that's a great place to ask questions. That's a great place to put in a discussion question, or even maybe to base one of your papers on, to look at that and say, I think there's more to the story. It's political science, so there's always more to the story, and there is something more that can be gained from delving into that. Now, a couple of different definitional understandings that I think it's good to jump into as we're discussing this thing. Maybe. There we go. There are, overall, two major ways to reason in comparative politics, and both of them are necessary. Now, you might know the phrase deductive reasoning as being very famous for inaccurately describing what Sherlock Holmes does. Sherlock Holmes actually does the inductive reasoning path. I don't know why I don't know, just in pop culture, it's always referred to as deductive reasoning. That's not actually what Sherlock Holmes is doing. What Sherlock Holmes does is he takes some general observation, right? I'm thinking to the Benedict Cumberbatch show where he looks at the type of soil on someone's shoe and then, can tell them where they walked their dog this morning. That kind of reasoning is inductive. It takes a very broad observation, something that can be experimental if you're running an experiment, or can be observations of the interactions of the world as they are, and then takes that and puts it down to a more specific crunch kind of level, where we can create some kind of theory or some kind of paradigm off of which we understand the way that a world is working. So taking it, creating these assumptions that I want to focus on. The other side of this, creating that theory first, creating an idea that you want the world to function by, and then using that to make predictions, kind of the traditional scientific process. That is deductive reasoning. I put both of these up there because both of them are important. Both of them function well within the concept of comparative politics. And I would even say that there are instances in which both are necessary. When you are examining a country for writing your comparative papers, when you are starting a new chapter in this textbook, understanding that you may have prior experience with this, with a governmental system. Let's just say the UK. Maybe you've traveled to the United Kingdom before and you have some experience with the United Kingdom's government. You might have this, basis on which to function with some understanding of what it is like in the United Kingdom. And, maybe it's the UK, maybe it's Mexico, maybe it's, any of the countries where we're going to be studying. You may have a very broad understanding of the place that it holds in the world, because maybe instead of going to the UK, maybe you've been to France. And France is a fairly comparable democracy to the United Kingdom, but is everything that is applicable in the United Kingdom going to be applicable in France? No, never will be. Other way around, also no. Is your experience in the UK going to be representative of every experience in the UK? Well, absolutely not, because, unless you've had the fortune to live there, you wouldn't even have a chance to really know what it's like to live and function under this system that the United Kingdom has established. So your traveling there and that experience doesn't give the same experience as what it might be living there. If you have lived there, awesome. Bring that in. Use that as a basis of experimentation, because your experience then is essentially an experiment of what it is to live under this kind of system. Can you take that and can you generalize that in such a way that we can start to understand this theory? There, like I said, this is intentionally cyclical because that is a major component of how we have to analyze countries in comparative politics. We have to understand that there are going to be similarities between countries. And those similarities mean that there are conclusions that we can draw about countries that may be accurate. There's also always going to be exceptions to those conclusions that we draw. I will call out for the fun of it. Don't tell Professor Aiken that I'm calling it out, but I will call out for the fun of it one of the main issues I have with international relations, and that's people in international relations who are steadfast with the democratic peace theory. If you've never heard of the democratic peace theory, it basically says democracies are by their nature more peaceful because a democracy will never go to war with another democracy. It is fairly well borne out. I'm not saying that there is not evidence. There's a wealth of evidence to this, because since the major movement of democracy around the world, major democracies don't go to war with other democracies. Part of that is sort of self-insular. It's because anytime that a semi-democratic country has gone to war with a democratic country, the political scientists just shove that into another category and say, oh, well, that's not a fully democratic country, so it can't qualify. It doesn't break our rule of democratic peace theory. All the democracies are still very, very peaceful and won't go to war with one another. You may also be aware of the fact that the United States is sometimes called a democracy. And you may question why this theory exists, since the United States has done a whole bunch of warlike stuff over the past 70 years. But the United States has not officially declared war since 1956. So that fits perfectly with the democratic peace theory, right? Nothing the United States has done since then could possibly count as war. Therefore, the United States is a very peaceful country. We are not a warfaring country at all. It's a lot of generalizations. It's a lot of things like that that I think are problematic within the field of international relations. We struggle between this realm of overgeneralization and undergeneralization, because if every single country is a case study unto itself and functions under its own rules and there's nothing shared, then comparative politics doesn't exist. However, if we compare everything, we start to expect countries to act too much like one another, and we end up missing things. Because even this theory is borne out through history. If you look at the Revolutionary War in the United States, and then France attempting to do the same thing less than a decade later, the United States was able to end up with a democratic representative constitution that has lasted for a couple of hundred years. France, on the other hand, fell back into monarchy and emperorship within a few decades, fought a whole bunch of wars, and then eventually did it again, and then had a successful revolution to implement democracy, and now has a very successful democracy. So, countries that may seem comparable, or countries that may seem to have these similarities, don't always bear out those similarities in the same way. To put a final point on this so that I'm not hammering it too hard into the ground. The United States and Australia, on the surface, are very close to the same kinds of countries. And they both have democratic representative systems. They both have, just around 300 million people that live there. They're both fairly, culturally diverse. They are both melting pots of cultures and individuals that live there. There's a lot that you can call parallel between Australia and the United States. And yet, to say that anything that applies in the United States when it comes to politics is the same as it is in Australia would massively miss the mark. And one of my colleagues at the university, Tim Lynch, who's here from Australia, will back that up. We had a wonderful conversation just before school got started, a wonderful conversation about just how different the United States and Australia are, even though a lot of people assume that they will just function the same. All right. Next on a couple of terms that you will hear when it comes to research, not just in political science, but also in most research that you do, is the difference between correlation and causation. Now, I ask on here, why do we want causation? And if you ask any researcher who does anything in the realm of statistics, they will say, like, the best paper that you could possibly find is one that's written on causation. Why is it that we want causation instead of correlation? Yeah, Reese.
Because without causation, any two statistics that you can find can work together to feed whatever conspiracy theory you believe in, or like the people dying in bed sheets and ski resort revenues. Nothing related.
Yeah, absolutely.
They can still give the appearance of some kind of relationship, but have no causation.
Yeah. Yeah, I threw up a few, I think, entertaining charts here that obviously convey what Reese is saying. It's nice, like I said, good papers are written on causation because we want to be able to find causes. That's, as we're studying these countries, as we're studying what they do, the way that they interact, it's really nice. And it feels nice to be able to say, okay, this is why Russia invaded the Ukraine 6 months ago. There's not just one answer for that, which is why we usually have to deal in the realm of multi-causality. But it would be really nice if there was just like, we had, I don't know, a journal article that said that was the day that Putin's astrologer said, hey, today's a good day to invade the Ukraine. Then we can be like, perfect. All right, that's the reason that it was invaded. No, there are a lot of reasons that Russia invaded the Ukraine, and a lot of them are very stupid, which is why the invasion of Ukraine has not been going well for Russia. It has also not been going well for the Ukraine. It's overall a bad situation. But there is no one thing we can point to and say, this is the reason that Russia took this action. And similarly, here, just for the entertainment's sake, are a few correlations that are not in fact causations. So the first one here, the divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine in the United States. Those two things are really closely correlated over a 9-year period. As you can see, they follow the same trends. You could, I don't know, if you really wanted to, you could write a paper saying that these two things are in fact causative. that the divorce rate in Maine, the number of people getting divorced, I don't know, maybe makes them eat more margarine. I don't know. Like, that's the thing. You have to. The problem with statistics is that there's always a story behind the statistics, right? And finding causation is writing that story. If you can make a really good story, you can probably get a paper published, but that doesn't always mean that it's the full story of explanation here, right? I don't think that the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in is actually causative of the number of female editors that sit on the Harvard Law Review. I'm sure you could make up a really good story to tie those two together, but those are not actually going to be a causative relationship. So we try to find causation, and oftentimes it is difficult because finding causation can be it can be a very disconcerting process, and it can also be a very confusing process, because you can oftentimes find something like this, find the number of people who died becoming entangled in their bed sheets, and you're like, oh look, this lines up really nicely with the total revenue generated by skiing facilities in the United States. But to tie those two together, to find that causation, is the difficult step and is often much more complicated than it may seem at first on the surface. I mentioned multi-causality. That is something that we most often will have to deal with in comparative politics. If you ask at any point in this class, and I encourage you to ask because it's why we're here, if you ask why a country did something, or why a country may or may not do something in the future. Like if you say, okay, well, is the United States going to end up, bombing Russia in response to its invasion of the Ukraine? My initial answer is always going to be, it depends. And that's not just me, being an egotistical political scientist who thinks he actually knows the answer to that kind of question. It's me saying it depends because it's a multi-causal question. There are a million factors at play that range from, literally, if you ask me, under one president versus another, the president's personality plays into the response to that kind of a question, all the way up to international factors of the way that Germany and the United States interact, and frankly, the German chancellor's personality as well, how well they get along with the president of the United States. That type of thing, all the way from the individual level to the multinational level, will all interact and influence what kind of answer you may get. That's again why prediction is so difficult, because prediction is often based off of this correlation, and it's not always a causative type of thing. I also throw up on here, I'm trying to wrap up this slide since we're at time, and we'll continue on Wednesday. I throw in here a question, and maybe this is a question you can think about and chat with your friends if you are at a lack of good conversation topics over the next few days. But we have this central of idea of, do Americans really want democracy? This is, I wrote this on a slide several years ago. This question, I think, has changed a lot in the past few years as far as our views of what democracy are, and also the major political parties' views of what democracy is or isn't. All of these things are in flux, and the answer to this kind of question has to come from a multi-causal perspective. So yeah, something to think about between now and Wednesday. We'll meet again at the same time on Wednesday and continue talking about this, what it means to states on the world stage, and also how those interact with nations that live within and without individual states. Awesome. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, I think that's a pretty good day.
Sounds good.
Excellent. I'll see you on Wednesday.
All right, will do.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.